Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Legal Power Hour, where we jam 60 minutes of thought-provoking discussion into a 30-minute show designed to inform, awaken, and protect our fellows. We are your co-hosts, Tom Scott and Sarah Nahidi, and today we are absolutely delighted to have with us on our show as a guest, Mr. Bob Grundstein. He hails from Morrisville, Vermont. He is an attorney and author of the fantastic book, Bad Minds, High Places, the FBI Raid on Cleveland. So one thing we like to do, Bob, with all our guests is you have a very unique story. Could you give us a brief background of where you are, why you got into law, and maybe perhaps, some of the highlights in this book, just to give our viewers an idea of truly how corrupt our legal system can be.
I'd be happy to, and I'd also like to say thank you for providing this audience and this opportunity to talk about my book. I would also like to mention your book, which is an important work. And with respect to my,
thank you, and you're welcome, of course.
With respect to my history, I grew up in a family. My father was for whom going to law school is something of a natural. I have this, just as an individual, I have this, ambiguity between art and analytics. And I put myself through law school as a chef, and I have a degree in classical music in performance as a pianist. I also like, thinking. My father was a professor of law, and my dad was basically made to be a judge. He was also active in public life in many different states. He was tapped to be a judge in Michigan. He was, just given his credentials and the culture of my house, going to law school was something, it was sort of a very available alternative. So you'd like to know something about the book?
Yeah, Bob, can you tell us briefly about what was your motivation to write this book? Because I know as somebody who read your book voraciously in one or two sittings, I mean, I couldn't put your book down, I think mostly because I couldn't even believe that these things happened. And so what was your motivation and purpose behind why you wrote this book?
Well, when you're being immolated, you want to put out the fire. When someone's flattening your toes with a ball-peen hammer, you need to tell someone to stop. You need to say, we have to stop doing this to people. My motivation was, my personal story. We're raised in America. You're just sort of raised to think the legal system is something that defends the rights of people who don't have institutional advantage, and it prefers constitutional principles, over income. The judges are paid and given very comfortable tenures to protect principle and not to not to prefer or prioritize income, power, and preferential association over the principles they're paid to uphold. Well, it turns out, especially where judges are elected, that maintenance values, income in particular, and tenure, and the professional relations and the lateral relations which support professional tenure and professional status are vastly prioritized over the rights they're paid to defend. It's like the hidden life of law. You think it's you think it's one way, and it's exactly the opposite. And so I got into trouble when I had a judge, his name is Peter Junkin, in Bedford, Ohio, who made a mess of a case. Made a mess of a case because he was sloppy. He's not that bright. And he's not that industrious. And he made a mess of a case, and I was just appalled that someone at his level, someone at his status of a judge, I mean, in my family, the idea of being a judge is very, the scholarship and competence and training were, you know, we expected it to be a very high level thing. Well, he was basically, you know, should have been wearing a paper hat and flipping burgers somewhere. So I was so appalled that I called the law director in a guy named Burdick in Bedford and said, "This guy's terrible. You know, everyone has to know. I'm going to pass out an editorial on the steps of the courthouse. Do you mind?" And he said, "No, it's fine. Just don't make, you know, just don't get violent. Don't throw things. Be nice." I said, "That's fine." So I went down to the Bedford in April of 2007. I went to the courthouse steps and passed out an editorial, and a lot of lawyers stopped to talk to me, and I passed it out. We discussed things, and it was a real non-event as far as I was concerned, you know, on that day.
Did you have any idea when you passed out that flyer that there would be severe consequences, repercussions?
No, nothing at all. Absolutely nothing. I mean, we have the First Amendment, free speech, in, you know, in public
Yeah,
forum.
we're supposed to, exactly.
But what happened was, I had no idea. Also, I didn't know with whom I was dealing. It turns out that as soon as I passed out this editorial, I passed it out in April of 2007. Within 6 weeks, false charges were brought to the grand jury in Cuyahoga County. Bedford is in Cuyahoga County, you know, Cleveland. It's basically the metropolitan area of Cleveland. And they brought charges in the grand jury, false charges, saying that I, you know, altered, you know, an original court document, and during, you know, in 2003, and I didn't know it because presentments to the grand jury are secret. Almost everybody gets indicted. Indicted is also known as a true bill, which means if someone, you know, the grand jury says, yes, a crime has probably been committed, they issue a true bill, and then you have to come in for arraignment and, you know, say are guilty or not guilty. I mean, it's very rare to get a no bill. That is to say, the refusal to indict. And when they brought the charges in June secretly, I got a no bill. It's like no one gets a no bill. They refused to indict because the charges were bad. So I got a no bill. Also, what I found out about this court, Bedford Municipal Court, was a former law director of this court, a guy named Tommy Longo, was on America's Most Wanted. He was a former law director and prosecutor for this same court, you know, a couple of decades ago. He was arrested in Mexico, you know, the foreign country, Mexico, on an international warrant for violations of probation and gun charges. And it turns out prior to this, you know, arrest warrant, he'd also been convicted of date rape, you know, giving girls drugs and having, you know, unconsented sexual activity with them, and dealing drugs with some of the local mafia in Little Italy. That was a law director and prosecutor at Bedford Heights. Then later, the same court where Peter Junkin was working. Then later, after the FBI raided, after I wrote my editorial, another judge, Harry Jacobs, was arrested and convicted on charges of facilitating prostitution. They were making, you know, cozy arrangements with someone who was running a whorehouse in Bedford. Another law director named Ken Schuman, who was also there while Judge Harry Jacobs was there, was arrested on some of the same prostitution charges and also for bribery. So that's four, you know, the place is basically a criminal conspiracy. You cannot work there unless you're, you know, unless you're corrupt.
Can you talk about how and why the FBI got involved and raided Cleveland?
Well, basically what the FBI did, Cleveland had a long history of being miserable. You have to remember that, you know, after Elliot Ness left Chicago, he immediately went to Cleveland. He did, you know, the Elliot Ness estate was next to the block I lived in. It was just right across the street, and a block across the street. And Cleveland always had like 50% of the police were on the take when Elliot Ness came. So Cleveland has a long history of corruption. It's always a problem. Plus, when you have heavy duty unions in a manufacturing city, you have this really tough competition over political appointments, contracts, money, jobs. Cleveland is a typical north central city, like, as I mentioned, Pittsburgh, Detroit, and Cleveland, where you have competition in public life based on race, ethnicity, and union affiliation. And union towns are very tough. They aren't playing. They're very tough people, not only in terms of how they control economies, but what happens to you if you break rules. I mean, you get hurt physically. Very tough places. And Cleveland always had a particularly bad culture. So the FBI, what happened in Cleveland is the FBI started around 1999 or 2000 to make a case. It was very expensive, and it took years and years and years to develop cases. Systemically, it was so bad in Cleveland, and the FBI wanted to make sure they were had competent cases, that they took a long time. It took like 8 years to develop their cases. And then suddenly in 2008, they started arresting people. 160 people, were indicted, and 60 people were convicted. We're talking judges, prosecutors. The county sheriff was convicted. That's the county sheriff, a guy named Gerald McFall. That's a big sheriff. He was the sheriff of the entire county. He was convicted on ethics violations and corruption. Judges went to jail. Prosecutors went to jail. The main prosecutor, Bill Mason, was forced to quit. The county executives went to jail. The county executives are very important. They're the head administrators. Contractors went to jail. Attorneys went to jail. So,
if after that, did the corruption and the situation change significantly in Cleveland? Like, do you have any idea what it's like today, or the aftermath of all those arrests and indictments?
Well, who knows? I'm sure it's better, but in a politicized system, you're going to have the same, problem. You're going to have a cycle. For example, Cleveland deteriorates, becomes unmanageable. And then the FBI, the feds come in and raid it. And that's all they can do. They have to, they have to use the legal system. They can't do mass arrests, without warrants and without probable cause, just in the nature of being American. They can't tear down the system. And so what happens is you have it cleaned up. You have the trash of one generation of, say, the prior 30 years being cleaned up to the extent it can by an FBI raid. But then the cycle just starts again. For example, the prosecutor under whom all this corruption happened, a guy named Bill Mason, who was pretty much, he was basically, he was monstrous. He had all his techniques for making sure that, people who were charged never came to trial, so that they were forced to take pleas. His first assistant is a guy named O'Malley during, the period of corruption. Well, it turns out that Michael O'Malley has recently been elected the prosecutor of Cleveland. So this is Bill Mason's first assistant who's back in. This is like having, Joseph Goebbels being elected the head of the German Democratic Republic after World War II. So in addition, a lot of the judges who were there during the corrupt tenure are still there. A guy named Frank Celebrezzi, who's in the Court of Appeals. He's a first-rate dunce. The people on the Supreme Court are still there. You have a lot of people in the Court of Common Pleas. They're elected.
What happened to that judge in Bedford that you wrote the editorial about that caused the false criminal charges to be brought?
He was removed.
He was removed?
He's gone.
Did that make you feel vindicated? Was that
no? No one really cares. That's the bitterness of it. Is I write this book, and then you say, okay, you send it to publishers in Cleveland. You say, okay, this is a big story. It's an easy to read book. It's about Cleveland. Cities tend to like local. You should get at least 15,000 sales out of it, and no one will touch it. None of the publishers in Cleveland, or even Columbus, which is the state capital, will touch it. They're afraid of being associated with it. That's one of the bitternesses. It's you become you think people will embrace you and congratulate you and publicize your virtue, but instead you become a pariah. You become a person. You become a risk to know, because the same the same standard of relationships among elected judiciaries still is there. The idea is, don't expose our incompetence, corruption, and failures. Support the group, or you'll never be able to participate in it. These, elected judiciaries, people will say, they're sort of saying there are 1.5 billion people in China. They say no. There are only 3 people in China, 3 big decision makers. In cities like Cleveland, where you have elected judiciary, you have a small group of people controlling appointments, who gets to run. The Democratic Party is very strong there. There's a family called the Corrigans who are very influential. They're very influential with deciding who gets to go where, and who gets nominated, who gets to run, who gets appointed. And there's a whole series of tit for tats, like this job is for Irish Catholics, this job is for Germans, this job is for American Black people. There's a whole arrangement which get made, and the idea is, don't upset the professional relations with these notions of intellectual quality and ethical behavior.
Bob, was this your first negative experience with the legal system that happened to you?
It was my first catastrophic experience. For example, I once went to my first experience with the legal system really was also a catastrophe. I remember my father departed, and my mother, my mother's estate, my mother decided to sell some of his collectibles, which she didn't need to do, but she sold them through a fine arts auctioneer. The fine arts auctioneer realized tens of thousands of dollars and gave her nothing. So I said, well, this is, she's a newly created widow. She's elderly. She's my mom. I'm going on the warpath here. So I sued. She was living in Cleveland. So I sued on her behalf. And I said, well, this is an easy case. The vulnerable widow of one of the most distinguished people in Cleveland, should certainly arouse a very angry response against the party, against the defendant, the fine arts auctioneer. Well, this is the first case I ever filed in Ohio on behalf of my mom. The case was dismissed on a procedural basis. I appealed and won, and it was sent back to the court. And it was sent back to the court to this woman named Lillian Green. And mind you, this is the first case I ever filed in Ohio. And opposing counsel, and it was after a successful appeal. The court said, no, this is a good case, hear it. Well, she didn't want to hear it. I don't know why. Opposing counsel came from quite a prominent law firm. I don't know why she didn't want to hear it. Maybe she was worried about offending one of the people who supports her campaign. It's the sort of anecdotal information that judges who are running for election rely on the contributions of attorneys and the public, and it's very common for them to keep lists about who supported them. It's the nature of the elected judiciary. It's like being a prostitute at the bus stop. You have to get someone to pay you, and you do favors. It's the conflict of interest is patent. It's just shameless.
And so what do you think a solution to the corruption that comes with elected judges?
Well, I at the end of my book, I made a solution. I said, one, you can't have elected judges. You have to have a different way to do them. But the people in charge, the vested interests in charge of elections, if you have the judiciary Oh, you just think what the judiciary does. It distributes wealth and exercises the police power. And if you have vested interests who want to have certain judges, especially large institutional interests, who need judges to protect their large capital investments, or who other interests, they want their candidate to be in to make to protect their investments and their income. So with that, given that situation, people with real resources are going to make sure their people are there. So no one wants to change it. You say, well, let's not have elected judges anymore. Well, the institutional economies that control politics aren't going to let this happen. They're not going to let it happen. And so, especially in places where you have very tough interest groups, which are very powerful, like unions, large industrial presences. So that's an idea, but it's not. No one's going to do it. Stop elections. Another idea is control them more, like have more judicial review, have every judge be subject to public review, or have attorneys make it so that attorneys after every case have to write a very short review, which is is scorable by a machine. Say multiple choice review of a judge after they've been through litigation, and judges have to, and they'd be scorable, and judges who make below a certain score have to become before a public review committee in which there are there's administrative hearing, which is public, and then there are a variety of sanctions like probation, admonition, re-education. One of the problems with judges is no one knows them. Like let's say let's say you go in as a plaintiff and you have an attorney. As a plaintiff who didn't go to law school, you don't know if the judge is good or not. You don't know if they're smart. You don't know if they're bad. Once you start getting the technicalities of the law, you're not qualified to say if they've been good or not. Secondly, there's no data about judges. I mean, people aren't going to go and read all the cases, and if they read all the cases, they won't know what they mean anyway. It's very hard to get data about an ongoing database about the quality of judges. You have, gossip, anecdotal information, but we don't have hard information about things.
Yeah, Bob, if I can add one thing to that, and I've thought about this myself, you're kind of mirroring a lot of the thinking that I put into this same solution to a problem, and that is that hard and fast data. Ultimately, whether a judge, in my view, is either elected or appointed, there should be some way of, if they are going to run for election, there should be no campaigning. It should be strictly based on data. People would look at data of the judge and decide strictly on that. And ultimately, every year or every 2 years, it would be the public that has the ability to pull these judges out. So they could be appointed by but at most they would be in there a year before the public would have the right to pull them out. Now, the public may have to take a certain test, because we don't want people getting in there that are also entities or others with conflicts of interest. We want a true random sampling of educated people, not dummies, that can analyze the data on these judges, strictly analytical data, and say whether this judge should be in there or not. So it seems like a blend, possibly the best option we would have of putting these judges and controlling them would be some kind of hybrid solution, which is kind of which is tantamount to what you're discussing right now, possibly with the public as the ultimate control valve at the end of pulling these judges out, right?
No, I agree, and there are people who are expert at this. I remember I went to Michigan and studied political science, and one of my professors was a guy named Kenneth Langston, who specialized in measuring social and political phenomena. So I can sort of, Tom, you and I can we can suggest an idea, but there are people, who are actually specialists in this sort of thing about how do you measure the quality of a judge. They're political scientists, so there are people who are experts. I know just enough, to say make a suggestion. So I agree with you, Tom. But I want to get back to Sarah. Sarah asked, was this your first catastrophe, getting, indicted for? No, in Ohio, it started out as a catastrophe. I was defending my mother after a successful appeal, and the judge, a woman named Lillian Green, who's known for being, just lazy and just underclass street tactics, just didn't want to hear the case. So what she did is, she said, "Well, you're really getting on my nerves, Bob. I'm hereby declaring you vexatious, which means this case is dismissed, and you can never file anything in Ohio again without my permission." Well, I said, one, you can't do that. I didn't do anything wrong. There's no rule. Rule 11 is the motion by which you find someone has been violated a rule or done something unethical. I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just conducting the case. Two, you can't do it on a motion. You have to file a new action with a new summons, complaint, and service, which you didn't do. It's unthinkable. It's unimaginable that someone in your position would even articulate this idea. So, but that's what she did. Opposing counsel was came from a very affluent law firm. They were well connected. Lillian, her staff was notorious for being intellectually deficient. I once spoke with one of her staff attorneys. He could barely articulate English. It was a very bad office. And I couldn't even defend a newly widowed 87-year-old mother of mine after a successful appeal by someone who's wasn't even close to following the rules. As a matter of fact, what she did was completely illegal and completely unsustainable and without any equitable or legal support. I did nothing wrong, and my briefs are always very good. So I said, well, I know, I'll appeal, no problem. This is, they'll see that this is basically someone who shouldn't have access, to the courthouse, shouldn't have access to pen and paper. She should be, licking out septic tanks somewhere. So I appealed, got my brief in, paid the filing fee. It was all very on time. This was in 2005. In March of 2006, 6 months later, they had me drive in from Vermont for oral argument, which is very standard. You go before the bank of, appellate judges in this very, beautiful old courthouse. And I remember them all. And there was a guy, they got in a special judge, pro tem, a guy named Corrigan, who's sitting there, and all the judges behind him. I saw a guy named Frank Celebrezi, whose father used to be, his family were governors and Supreme Court justices.
I remember that name. They have
Frank's a first-rate dunce. I mean, Frank should be a tunnel support somewhere. But so you're looking at these people, and then they get this judge Corrigan, who's not in the pro tem, temporary, who's not on the bank on the 8th District Appellate Court, and he's talking. He goes, "Your appeal's been canceled." I said, "What do you mean it's been canceled? I just drove here from Vermont. I filed, within 30 days. I sent you my brief. I sent the filing fee. You had me, you sent me the schedule for oral arguments. I'm here." He goes, "Sorry, it's been canceled. What are you going to do about it?" That's the way.
Whoa, hold on. He actually said, "What are you going to do about it?"
No, that's me. He just said,
Okay.
It's been canceled. Your appeal is canceled. You don't get an appeal. And then no one does anything. And that was normal in Cleveland. That's the way political things happen. Lillian Green was in the court of first resort. She called, she called someone and said, "I don't want to be embarrassed on this." I said, "No problem. You're one of us." So the most fundamental things get violated without responsibility. And that was my first case in Cleveland ever. And it wasn't, I didn't even want money. I just wanted to get my mom's money back.
What a horrible experience.
And then it just got worse and worse and worse and worse and worse.
Bob,
I read part of your book, Bob. Sarah, I'm sure, has a question, but this is like, Kafka or Orwell's 1984 on steroids. I mean, this is unbelievable. You mentioned this family in the forward of O'Malley's. I think I counted 8 of them, this incestuous cesspool. you know, it's given me second thoughts. Now, we've interviewed people all over the country. Washington State in particular is wildly corrupt. The People's Republic of Massachusetts is right out there, but I'm thinking truly Ohio may have the blue ribbon.
Well, I'll tell you, in 2010, when the FBI raids were going on, the head of the FBI said Cleveland is the most corrupt city in the country at this time. Worse in Baltimore, worse in Chicago, worse in New Orleans, worse than anything. And also, I'm glad you brought up Washington, Tom, because I just want to remind you that, repeat, I can't remember if I said it on the air, but the president of the Washington State Bar Association, Robin Haynes, was arrested on June 20th for felony theft. And the Seattle Times, paper there, refused to carry the story. I found out about it because the Spokane, which is, you know, the western part of the country going out near Idaho, carried it.
Bob, can you tell our viewers where they can get a copy of your book? I mean, I know I enjoyed reading it immensely, and I'm sure that people who are interested in the subject would love to read your book.
Well, thank you. It's on Amazon. And it's also on, you know, many other websites, Barnes and Noble. I think what they happen is, as soon as they all carry it, and if you put in the name, place, you know, all the big internet stores will have it. But it's certainly on Amazon.
And one of the things we talk about in our book is that there's no competition, there's no market competition for the legal system. And I know that's something, Bob, that you've agreed with.
Oh, no, that's a great idea. That's what I really like about your book. Like I say, you know, a book is 3 pages. Good books have a fundamental theme. That's what I really liked about your book. And it's just this fundamental, this basic truth is that the legal system doesn't have an economic competitor to keep it honest. Like in, you know, with doctors, they have insurance companies insuring them very high premiums. And they have an economic competitor in the form of their patients who will hold them accountable, and attorneys, which will elicit very high, potentially very high penalties for malpractice. But judges,
they have none.
The people who do surgery, they're only accountable to themselves, and they're not. They're an interest group. They're not going to hold one another accountable in a stringent fashion. Plus, I mean, even let's say, Sarah, I mean, you're an attorney, and Tom, you know, you're a bright guy. Let's say the law. I mean, Tom's a scientist. You know, the law is different from hard empirical science, where the methods are self-checking. Like, let's say you do math, and the equation's not right. It doesn't work. Or in genetics, you know, you do something, you do an experiment, and subsequent generations of mice don't have the, you know, the spots they should have. The method's self-checking. With law, it's much softer, and you don't, you know, you can't tell a failed decision, you know, quite as easily. It's subject to dispute, even between really good minds and good mentalities, and, you know, people who are, you know, they say even between good men and women, they may dispute what is the proper outcome of a case based on the facts and the applicable law. It's difficult. The method itself is not as precise, and law systems, you know, you really don't know if they failed, you know, badly, until you have something catastrophic, like, you know, a civil war or an FBI raid. You can do a lot more damage, or a lot more damage can occur prior to a corrective activity.
It's sad, but it's the unfortunate reality that we're dealing with at this point. I mean, I know the 3 of us could sit here and talk endlessly about, you know.
Well, you wrote a book. No, but the
corruption.
You've done something. You wrote a book. I think one of the problems in America is, you know, legal systems are evidence they're evidence. You know, they're evidence of a culture of thought and ethical behavior and the way humans value one another. And with America, we're a nation. I think we're a nation in decline. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen immediately. But we now run our personal relations like our business relations. And the idea of relations which aren't utilitarian is becoming less and less supported in our ethical and moral culture of our people as a whole. We've certainly lost our innocence, and it gets more and more difficult to sustain non-utilitarian, non-functional notions of human behavior and human relations when we're entering a time of shortage. I mean, the relationship between work and wealth in America has gotten more difficult. I remember, you know, it used to be, college you go to good middle-class college, like even an Ivy League school. I remember I went to Michigan out of state. It cost maybe 15%, maybe 20% of a middle-class salary. And a house was maybe 100% of a middle-class salary, you know, get a nice house for. Now the relationship, you know, now to go to a good college is worth, it's almost, you know, it's $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year. That's what a middle-class person makes. Or a house, you know, a house is no longer, you know, you don't pay for a house in 1 year unless you're very, you know, very wealthy. The relationship between work and wealth has changed. So
I agree.
We're in an age of more anxiety now, and the cost of doing right, the cost of engaging in relationships which aren't advantageous becomes a little higher.
Yeah. We're just about out of time here, Bob. But one thing for sure, I think you just kind of also hit on an important point. We've kind of gone down the rabbit hole, perhaps too far. Maybe there's no resurrection. I don't know. But you know, Jefferson warned 300 plus years ago, the destruction of our country lies in the judiciary. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. You know, I think he really hit it. Unless you have any quick comment you want to make, Sarah. I can't believe Bob's still. You still have your JD, right, Bob? Is that true?
I'm sorry?
Have your JD, right?
Oh yeah, you can't pay. You can't take the bar without having a JD. Unless, no, that's not true. You can apprentice. It's called reading for the law in some states, but yes.
Right. I'm just surprised you still have it. I mean, after what the system did to you, I'd be hell-bent on taking it down. I am hell-bent on taking out the bad apples for sure. And that's the purpose of our book. But, you know, I just got to say, this has been an exceptional conversation. All I can do is highly recommend that our viewers read your book. I know initially in the conversation you said it's very difficult to get a publisher, especially in your homes or the state of Ohio, because they'd be effectively in the spotlight on their own, you know, be a conflict of interest for the big powers. But for the everyday people, they should be reading your book. I mean, there's and then there's, if it can happen to you, like Sarah said, it can happen to anyone. So we'd like to thank you.
Compliment you very much. And I think your statement about Jefferson is a very important, you know, statement that needs to be repeated. It's a good job. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob, for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Then, of course, to tell our viewers, I hope they enjoyed this show. It's Bob is a very unique individual, has some excellent experience that all our viewers should learn from. But certainly everyone can catch our show fresh every first Monday of the month at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, or view it any time afterward right here on our YouTube channel. Be sure to subscribe to our blog for informative monthly posts at www.stloiyf.com/blog. And in addition to Bob's book, if you truly want to protect yourself to the fullest extent possible against our wildly corrupt legal system, be sure to also pick up a copy of our book, Stack the Legal Odds in Your Favor.
It's a very useful book.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you. And we're glad you liked our book as well.
Bye.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks again, Bob. Take care. Bye.
Bye.